Welcome to today's webinar, Farms Under Threat, the State of the States, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and subscribe to our e-newsletter to get news and information about smart growth and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also learn about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNU-A CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Farms Under Threat, the State of the States. You can also search for event number 920-2892. So to get started, our speakers today are Julia Freedgood, Mitch Hunter, and Jennifer Dempsey. Julia Freedgood is a national expert in farmland protection, agricultural viability, and food systems, and she leads the American Farmland Trust's efforts to support the future of farming by increasing land access and supporting new next-generation farmers. She co-authored Cultivating the Next Generation, Resources and Policies to Help Beginning Farmers Succeed in Agriculture, and leads the Trust's efforts to train trainers and build a network of service providers to help beginners secure land and succeed in agriculture. Freedgood co-authored the Trust's Farm Under Threats report that we're talking about today. She was a co-PI of the USDA NIFA-supported project Growing Food Connections and published Growing Local, a community guide to planning for agriculture and food systems to strengthen local economies and improve community food security. She holds a Master of Arts in Urban and Environmental Planning and Policy from Tufts University. Mitch Hunter leads AFT's scientifically rigorous collaborative research program, including its Farms Under Threat initiative. He returned to AFT in 2019 after serving as a federal policy manager and helping to advance farmland conservation in the 2014 Farm Bill. Mitch earned a doctorate in agronomy from Penn State University, where his thesis focused on sustainable intensification and climate resilience, particularly using cover crops to improve soils and help crops survive drought. Mitch enjoys gardening, exploring the wilderness, and helping out on his parents' grass-fed beef farm in Minnesota. Finally, Jennifer Dempsey manages the Farmland Information Center, a clearinghouse of resources used by AFT staff, agricultural landowners and farmers, farmland protection professionals, planners, policymakers, academics, and the media. As part of this work, she oversees the FIC's nationwide surveys, which includes annual surveys of farmland protection programs, transfer of development rights programs, and a survey of land trusts that protect land for agriculture. Jennifer completed her undergraduate work at Mount Holyoke College and earned a Master of Science in Resource Management and Administration from Antioch, New England Graduate School. Following the presentation today, Julia, Mitch, and Jennifer will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during the presentation by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. So with that intro out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to Julia. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that introduction. It was very comprehensive. And to all joined us. We're really excited to be here and to share our findings from our latest Farms Under Threat research. I think we're going to run a poll so that we can find out who is with us in our virtual room here. So please select one of these categories so we have a sense of who we have with us today.
And you can see the 5 choices there. We'll give you about a minute to respond, and then we'll show the results for everybody. Give you another second or two. And you can see now that the half of the group is in planning, 31% local government, state government officials, and then 7% ag preservation and 6% economic development and academic.
That's great, thank you. It's just really helpful for us to have a sense of who we're with. It's always strange not to be able to see people when we do these kinds of presentations. So anyway, so now we're going to go on and share the agenda for what we're going to do today. Mitch, can we have the next slide? Great. And one of the things that I just want to stress is we really hope you will participate as much as possible. So ask questions with the directions Michael gave you, but also take the polls as we go along, because that helps us also stay in touch with where you're at. So I'm gonna start out with talking a little bit about the drivers of ag land conversion, and then I'm gonna hand off to Mitch, who's gonna share the findings from our spatial analyses. And then Jen is gonna take us through the policy response and the ag land policy scorecard that we developed. And then I'm gonna come back and share some sort of high-level state recommendations, and then we'll go back to you for questions and answers. So what is Farms Under Threat? It's a multi-year initiative that we started about 5 years ago to document the status of and threats to agricultural land in the US. But we don't want to just be Chicken Little. We also want to offer policy responses to make sure that we sort of get our heads out of the sand and do something to address the threats in a way that serves both our land base and also our agricultural industries. We partnered with conservation science partners on the spatial analyses and with the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service, who shared a lot of data, some even proprietary data with us, and a lot of technical assistance and advice, as well as core funding. Today, we're sharing findings from our second report, which is the State of the States. And it really is focused on what's happening within each state, painting a really, I think, striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches, but also the steps that states have taken to protect and retain their agricultural land base for the sort of economic activity of working farms and ranches as well. So our approach, and I think the whole slide is going to come in. I don't know. Looks like we have about half of it. But anyway, our approach was to use spatial mapping to identify the threats to ag land. And we did then followed by an in-depth analysis of state policy responses. And then we brought this research together so that we could offer recommendations and ways for folks to move forward in their own states and with local governments to make changes on the ground. And we looked at, let's go to the next slide, Mitch. So we really wanted to look at sort of what was the history and what are the drivers of ag land conversion. And we found that, of course, it's poorly planned development, but it also is weakening of agricultural viability, and not just on individual farms and ranches, but really across the agricultural sector in different communities, as well as the fact that land is very vulnerable when it transfers between generations. And what we found is that really since the beginning of this movement, if you will, all the way back to say 1956 when Maryland passed the first tax policy to support farms, policymakers have been aware of these threats and developed, sort of starting then, but really since the 1980s, developed a toolbox of policies and programs to respond. At the same time, what we found that even though there have been really positive actions, these drivers continue to threaten our agricultural land base today. And so we'll just start with poorly planned development, which of course, given the audience here, you're all very familiar with. We focused some of our research really on what's happening with low density residential development. So wanted to see what was happening in the context of housing starts, as well as population growth. And what you can see is that the period that we studied, which was this century, so 2001 to 2016, really had the most depressed amount of housing starts, as well as development in general, and also low population pressure. But what you'll find out when Mitch shares the results from the spatial analyses is that low density residential land use, especially in more rural regions, is still transforming the agricultural landscape, fragmenting working farms and ranches, limiting management and marketing options, and weakening farm economies, all leading to, sort of paving the way to urbanization. And I think it's just really striking that we continue to lose farmland during the Great Recession, even though housing starts were, really in the toilet and population growth had declined. So going forward, we hope you'll be aware that those pressures continue, and that's something that we really can accommodate through good, smart growth policies. When it comes to sort of ag viability, if farmers and ranchers can't make their ends meet, they're much more likely to sell their land. Consolidation in farm sales has become nearly universal, especially across commodity crop production. Agricultural wealth has become concentrated on fewer and fewer, larger and larger farms. And what we've really seen is movement away from small and mid-sized family farms to large and extremely large farms. You can see in the chart that red block at the top is kind of the trajectory of the very large farms, those with over $1 million and in many cases over $10 million in market value, has been growing very steadily, while the other categories, especially the smaller commercial farms that have market value, say less than 250,000, which would be in beige, have kept shrinking over, the last 20, 25, 30 years. Along with the consolidation of wealth has come consolidation of cropland, and conversion of ag land further limits supply, leading to increased land values, also reinforcing consolidation. So these two things become really intertwined, the economics and the land use. And all of this then drives up land prices, making it harder for a new generation to enter agriculture. And as you heard from the intro, that's something that concerns me very much. So today, 4 times as many farmers and ranchers are age 65 and older as under the age of 35, which is really in stark contrast to the general workforce, where more than 6 times as many people under 35 are employed as those over 65. Seniors sort of at retirement age of 65 and older own more than 40% of US ag land, suggesting an impending transfer of over 370 million acres in the next 10 to 20 years. And in the past, ag land usually transferred within a farm through what they say cradle, altar, or grave, really within the family. But this is less and less true. Today, most producers don't inherit their land, so access to land has become a major barrier to entry. This is really a huge challenge, especially for the diverse new generation of young, beginning, and historically disadvantaged farmers who want to enter the field. And then the new trend that we're paying a lot of attention to, which of course has not been captured in historical trends, is climate change. And I think, everybody probably on this call is well aware that extreme weather events have increased dramatically over the past 30 or 40 years, floods, droughts, fires, and other symptoms. What you may not be as aware of is that food crops, especially food like fruits and vegetables, are especially sensitive to climatic stressors. And developing ag land and exacerbates climate change. So we found in some of our research that ag land produces far fewer GHG emissions than land converted to housing or commercial use. In a study that we did called Greener Fields in California, we found that ag land converted to other uses emits greenhouse gases at a level as much as 70 times greater than it had been in farming, really 58 to 70 times greater. But at the same time, ag land managed with regenerative, sound farming practices can help combat climate change by sequestering carbon in the soil. So bottom line, we need farmland to grow food and other crops and to provide essential environmental services, including carbon sequestration. And that means that the case for farmland protection has never been stronger. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Mitch.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mitch Hunter. I'm the research director here at AFT, and I just want to thank you all again for joining us today. As we get going here, I'm interested to hear what the folks in the audience think is the main driver of farmland conversion. So I'm going to ask John to run poll number 2.
Okay, and it's now open. So you can see between the following categories, which of these claim more agricultural land between 2001 and 2016. You have 2 options. We'll give you a few seconds to respond. And if folks are having any issues with responding to the poll, it may be that you're in full screen mode. You may need to exit that momentarily to respond to the poll. Okay, so the response here is 76% low density residential and 24% traditional urban and suburban.
All right, that's really interesting, and we're going to get a chance to see down the road if our results bear that out. So now I'll share with you how we did our spatial analysis. As Julia mentioned, we worked with partners at Conservation Science Partners to do this analysis, so I want to thank them again. And the first step in the analysis was to use advanced tools to map agricultural land use at 10-meter resolution across the lower 48 states. And unfortunately, Alaska and Hawaii were excluded because the underlying federal data was not available. This resulted in the map that you see here, which identifies 4 types of agricultural land: cropland, pasture land, rangeland, and woodland associated with farms. We also map Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service lands with grazing leases on them. And all told, this gives us the most comprehensive spatial analysis of US agricultural land use ever conducted. It combines the complete spatial coverage from the National Land Cover Database with on-the-ground information from USDA and USGS. The next step was to identify the best agricultural lands for producing food and other crops. And we did this by creating the first ever index of agricultural land quality that explicitly accounts for productivity, versatility, and resiliency, which we call the PVR index. And as soon as this map loads up on your screen, there you go. This map shows the range of PVR, or productivity, versatility, and resiliency values on private agricultural land across the US. Not surprisingly, each state has its own range of PVR values, and that's really part of why this index is so powerful, because any state can use it to identify their own best land. But we also use the PVR index to identify the best land in the country for producing crops, and especially human edible food crops, the same ones that Julia mentioned are especially sensitive to climate change. And we call this land nationally significant agricultural land. While this land is clearly concentrated in certain parts of the country, every state has its own supply of nationally significant land as well. The final step, and the one that might be of most interest to this group, is that we mapped the conversion of agricultural lands to more developed uses from 2001 to 2016. And we mapped this conversion to 2 types of land use. The first is called urban and highly developed land use, or UHD, and it's been identified using satellite remote sensing. So this category includes the traditional culprits in farmland conversion, including expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas. UHD is largely found in and around cities and towns, but this category also includes rural, industrial, and energy production sites, which includes oil and gas well pads and solar panel installations. We mapped UHD using all of the developed categories from the National Land Cover Database. I imagine many of you are familiar with the National Land Cover Database, or NLCD. And since we used all of the developed categories, for us, this UHD category includes developed open space, such as parks and golf courses, since for the purposes of agriculture, those are no longer available for production. The second type of conversion is one that Farms Under Threat is mapping for the very first time. We call it low density residential land use, or LDR. And we undertook this analysis to help identify the impacts of large lot housing on the agricultural land base, which are not captured in the traditional urban and highly developed category. LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. And typically, this kind of scattered large lot housing fragments the agricultural land base and limits production, marketing, and management options for the working farms and ranches that remain. So in short, when a lot of non-farm neighbors move in, it just gets harder to farm. And since I have an audience of real land use experts today, I'm going to go into greater depth about how we identified LDR areas. These areas are nearly impossible to see using remote sensing. As you can see in the bottom image on the screen, the development footprint is pretty dispersed and there's a lot of green area in between them. Because of this challenge, we needed to use a different approach, and we ended up using US Census blocks. We determined a, quote, viable farm size threshold in each county, which is basically the minimum size that a property can be to sustain a viable commercial farm. So we identified that threshold, and then we identified census blocks where the average lot size was below this threshold. And this was a good approach because the whole country is delineated into census blocks, and we can quantify the number of housing units in each one. And this method yielded a spectrum of land use patterns, ranging from developed land to areas where agriculture may not be fully developed, but is compromised. And the left image here shows an example of a developed LDR area where former agricultural land has been cut up into 2 to 5 acre lots. The middle image is further down the spectrum, illustrating LDR areas that are still open space in pink there in the middle, but are adjacent to rapid development and are most likely just the next domino to fall. And finally, the right image shows an LDR area that looks like viable agricultural land on first glance, but actually has a relatively high housing density. And in the right circumstances, agriculture may be able to persist in LDR areas by taking advantage of direct marketing opportunities. But in general, as residential use intensifies, farmers have fewer management and marketing options, land values in the area tend to escalate, and this all makes it harder and harder to stay in business, much less for a new generation to enter agriculture and succeed. When we did all this analysis and put it all together, overall, we found that development continues to threaten every single state's best agricultural land. From 2001 to 2016, we converted 11 million acres of agricultural land, which is equal to all the land in the country planted to fruits, nuts, and vegetables, or 2,000 acres a day paved over, built up, and converted to uses that threaten the future of agriculture. We also found that low density residential land use is a major threat. So you all were right, or not, well, yeah, the majority of this group was right. I think it was 76% that believe the low density residential land use would be the greater conversion threat. That is what the data bore out. Out of the 11 million acres, 4 million went to urban and highly developed land use, and nearly 7 million were converted to low density residential land use. And to us, the prevalence of LDR conversion was a little bit surprising. I think it's really the first time that it's been well quantified, and it points to a real need for new policy and planning approaches. I think we've known it's happening, we've known it's an issue, but in many cases, state and local governments haven't done a lot to respond. These 11 million acres of conversion threaten our food supply. They make it harder for farmers and ranchers, especially new producers, to access the land that they need, and they jeopardize the environmental benefits that a well-managed farmland and ranchland can provide, whether that's clean water or wildlife habitat or carbon sequestration. And all of these negative effects of conversion are even worse when we convert our best land. But sadly, from 2001 to 2016, 4.4 million acres of agricultural land that we designate as nationally significant were converted to UHD or LDR. And this shows that states and localities are not protecting their irreplaceable agricultural resources. All of these findings are summarized in this one key map. It gives a state-by-state look at where conversion falls relative to each state's land resources. And while some of the patterns may be hard to see at the national scale, I can assure you that they're crystal clear when you zoom into our detailed maps. These detailed maps are available on our interactive website, and we're also happy to share our data with anyone who would like to use it for land protection or research purposes. You can see on this map that farmland and rangeland are divided into the top half and the bottom half of each state's agricultural land according to our PVR analysis. That's easiest to see in Iowa, which has lots of great land, of course, but the land north of Des Moines is generally higher quality than the land in the southern part of the state, and that really comes through on the map. This shows again that our analysis can help each state identify and protect its most important agricultural resources, even though every state is different. The red areas show where conversion has occurred, whether to urban and highly developed or low density residential land use. And you can see that the conversion tends to wrap around existing cities and towns, but there are also certainly areas where conversion extends far into the countryside, especially low density residential conversion. I wanted to break these numbers down so you can see how those 11 million acres of conversion fall out across the states. And on an acreage basis, Texas stands out, which is not surprising given the size of the state and the rapid pace of population growth there. But Texas alone converted nearly 1.4 million acres from 2001 to 2016. Beyond Texas, there was a lot of conversion in California, the Eastern Corn Belt, and especially the Southeast. In fact, North Carolina converted the second most acres nationally, even though it is only 30th in total agricultural acreage. When you look at the percent of each state's land that was converted, you can see that the East Coast and the South stand out. New Jersey is the leading state in terms of percentage, having converted nearly 9% of its agricultural land. As the most densely populated state in the country, this isn't surprising. But again, North Carolina and its neighbors in the Southeast had high percent conversion rates, despite being much larger and more sparsely populated. Finally, I want to share with you our list of the top 12 most threatened states. This list combines acreage and percent conversion, which is why Texas, North Carolina, and New Jersey are all clustered at the top, even though they face very different types of threats. So that's the end of my summary. Now I'm going to ask John to run poll number 3, and we're making our spatial data freely available, like I said. So I'm curious how many people in this audience would have an interest in accessing that data.
A very simple yes or no question. Are you interested in accessing the data sets, yes or no? And we'll give everybody a little bit of time again. Very good response so far. And if anybody is having problems with the polling feature, please let us know through the questions tab. Okay, very much a lot of interest here. 83% said yes. Mitch.
That's fantastic. Great. So I'm actually about to show you how you can go about requesting that data. We've developed a custom website to share both the spatial data I've been describing and the policy data, which Jen will cover in a few minutes. So I'm going to, well, actually, I think you're probably already seeing it. I'm going to make it full screen here. And I'm just going to give you a quick tour of the website, so you can go away from this webinar with this as another tool for your work. It's organized with tabs, as you can see, and this first tab is a welcome. It gives an overview and is a good way to find your way to more resources. Then we have a spatial mapping tab, our policy scorecard tab, and finally the call to action, which Julia will be covering at the end of our webinar. We also have this link in the top right, and I think you can see that if you use this link and you scroll down, there's one of the selections is called geospatial data layers. That's how you can go about submitting a form request to get access to our data. So please go ahead and do that. We'd love to share it as widely as possible. And there's also a lot of other resources here, the executive summary of our report, the full report in PDF format, and a number of other elements. I want to go a little bit deeper, just give you a brief intro to our different data layers, both spatial and policy. So you can see here, you start out at the national level with some national information summarized on the left side of the screen. And we're looking at a layer called conversion of agricultural land. So that's getting right at what I was just summarizing. If you want to zoom in, you can click on any state. I'm going to click on Minnesota because that's where I live. And then you can zoom in further using the plus and minus buttons in the bottom right of the screen. And so we're zoomed in here on the Twin Cities. You can see the conversion pattern, and you can keep going to a really high degree of zoom. And since I'm clicked into Minnesota now, we're showing Minnesota statistics on the left side of the page. Same goes for all the different states in the lower 48. You can change the layer to instead look at land cover and use. Instead of looking at conversion, you can see where the different land covers that are agricultural or development related play out across the landscape. And then we also have the layer of productivity, versatility, and resiliency, so you can get a sense of the agricultural land quality. There's some more summary statistics down below if you scroll down, but I won't go into here, but interesting stuff to take a look at and think about. And then I'm going to scroll back up and try to show you this link here on the left. Right on the left side, there's a link that says download Minnesota conversion summary. If I click on that, it will open a new tab with a PDF document, a nice 2-page PDF that you can download, you can print, you can share with stakeholders. It's really great for educational purposes and quite easy to use. So that's a great resource. Okay, hopefully you're all following along. I'm trying to watch to make sure that it's sharing well with the audience, but it's a little tricky. So I'm going to go back to the website now and go over to the policy tab. To shake things up, I'm going to check out Oregon. And as you can see, hopefully when you click on Oregon, it will zoom down the page to Oregon policy scores. And so here we can see for the policies that Jen is about to talk about, how Oregon scored and how that state's score relates to the median for the country and also the top score for the country. You can go down even further and you'll see the scorecard and score sheets. This will all be a lot clearer after Jen presents, but it's a real wealth of information that you can look at here. And if you go all the way to the bottom, you'll see this section called How We Scored It, which will give you a sense of how we scored it, what factors we use to determine these scores. I'm going to, again, scroll back up because just like with the spatial summary, we also have a policy highlight summary. And that link is right here, right above the bar chart with the scores. So if I click on it, that will take you to another 2-page PDF document that will give you a good summary of the policy situation in Oregon as it relates to other states and some details about what's going on in Oregon. Okay, the last tab is the call to action, and that really is going to have similar information to what Julia will cover today on the webinar, but it's a good reference as well. I'm going to switch back to the other screen and hand it off to Jen.
Great, thank you, Mitch. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to ask John now to launch our next poll question for everyone.
Okay, so that's open on people's screens. And again, if you have issues with responding, exit the full screen. Which of the following policies is the most important for protecting ag land and maintaining viable farms and ranches? And you can see 5 options there. And we'll keep it open for another 30 seconds or so. We'll show the results here. So 57% land use planning, 24% purchase of agricultural conservation easements, 11% ag districts, 8% property tax relief, and 0% for farm link.
Great, and I'll explain how this relates to the policy scorecard a little later. This is an almost complete list of some of the approaches that we examined. And you'll get a chance later on to understand how our experts helped us think about and rank the different policy approaches. So this afternoon, I'm going to actually explain what the Ag Land Protection Scorecard is, our approach, and what we found. So in tandem with our spatial analyses, which Mitch just ran through, AFT conducted research on programs and policies that protect agricultural land, support viability, and ensure that land is available for current and future farmers and ranchers. And this is the work that resulted in what we call the Agricultural Land Protection Scorecard. We analyzed 6 programs and policies that are tied to the land and have been implemented in at least 10 states. We used both quantitative and qualitative factors to measure program performance, and we're also trying to highlight effective practices. The results end up being summarized in the policy score sheets. You saw the online version that Mitch was demonstrating. And we also rolled up scores from each policy to generate policy response scores. These combined scores are presented in the overall scorecard, and they serve as a broad indicator of each state's policy response. The purpose of the scorecard and the supporting score sheets is really to raise awareness about effective approaches, to inform state and also federal policy action, and just to encourage more farmland protection. So for the initial round of the scorecard, we examined 6 approaches: purchase of ag conservation easement programs that permanently protect farmland and ranch land from non-farm development. PACE programs compensate landowners who voluntarily place an ag conservation easement on their property. We also reviewed state planning policies, which is probably of particular interest to this group. We looked at policies that are managing growth and stabilizing the land base. And as you know, most states delegate planning authority to local governments, but some play a much more active role. And I will provide more details about the specific planning actions that we considered on the next slide. We also assessed property tax relief programs that are reducing property taxes paid on agricultural land. The most common approach, which most of you are probably familiar with, is use value assessment, which is just assessing farmland and ranch land at its value for agriculture. We looked at agricultural district programs that encourage landowners to form special areas to support agriculture. And I want to point out that these are distinct from the districts created by zoning ordinances. They're really empowering the landowners to form the special areas. Enrolled farmers receive protections and incentives, which can include limits on annexation, eminent domain, protection from the siting of public facilities, but also tax incentives and sometimes protections from nuisance complaints. We also looked at FarmLink programs, which are connecting land seekers with landowners who want their land to stay in agriculture. And finally, and this approach was actually left off the poll, we considered state leasing programs that are making state-owned land available to farmers and ranchers for agriculture. So now I'm going to provide just a little bit more detail about the state planning actions that we considered. Most are in the context of the land use planning score sheet. So in this context, we looked for explicit state goals to protect agricultural land. Sometimes we found these goals in state comprehensive or land use plans. This was not unusual in smaller states. Other times, the goals were set forth in state law or administrative rules, as is the case in Washington and Oregon. We also looked for requirements for local governments to develop comprehensive plans, because this lays the foundation for local land use policies where many land use decisions are actually made. And as many of you may be aware, Oregon is requiring cities and counties to develop comprehensive plans. Other states encourage comprehensive planning by requiring them in order to form local planning bodies and or to adopt zoning. We looked at consistency between the state goals and the local plans. So some states had strong mechanisms in place to ensure this kind of alignment. And we considered whether the state required localities to adopt measures to protect important agricultural resources that they had identified in their comprehensive plans. We also looked for farmland protection planning efforts. And these are efforts that are really a more narrow, specialized, focused planning process, usually overseen by state departments of agriculture instead of local planning bodies. And they typically involve setting goals for permanent protection, prioritizing areas for protection, and recommending and implementing specific policies, often purchase of ag conservation easement programs. And we found this in Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, New Jersey, and New York. And farmland protection planning can be linked to local comprehensive planning and inform it. So we found other links to planning outside of the traditional and what is contained in our land use planning score sheet. So as we were looking at PACE, we found that some state PACE programs actually make farmland protection planning a prerequisite for applying for state funding. And we also know that some communities are using PACE to help implement their local plans, because the permanently protected land can reinforce exclusive ag zoning or urban growth boundaries. In addition, we found as we were looking at agricultural districts that local planning bodies can be involved in the formation of them. So this can be as simple as notification before the formation of the district by the landowners. But in some instances, the planning body actually reviews and signs off or approves the district. And this type of coordination is really important because these geographic areas may include restrictive agreements on the enrolled land and may also do things like limit siting of public facilities, extension of infrastructure, or even limit annexation. So it's good to make sure they're consistent with community plans and that there's this tie to planning. So again, I'm just going to pause and point out that we were focusing on land use planning, so actions to manage growth and protect agricultural land. But later, Julia will talk about how planning for agriculture can be a broader concept and can also work to support agricultural viability and encourage sound resource conservation. So now I'm just going to run through our approach. There were several steps in our method. To select policies, we interviewed farmland protection professionals and reviewed the available literature. We initially looked at 9 policies, but we ultimately limited our analysis to 6. Again, we were looking for those tied to the land and adopted by at least 10 states. We developed factors to measure program performance. We used 39 factors. Most were qualitative, but about a dozen were quantitative and based on values we calculated using available data like information from the Census of Agriculture. Next, we just reviewed state laws, rules, implementation materials, and we also conducted surveys and talked to some of the program managers. And this research was all conducted from 2016 to 2019. Our last steps were just calculating the scores and conducting some analyses. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on the next slide. So to combine the scores for the individual policies into a single policy response score, we needed to determine the relative importance or weight of each approach. So we surveyed 20 experts, which included AFT staff, but mostly included people outside our organization. And we asked them to rank the different approaches. And so this relates back to the poll question we asked you. In our exercise, purchase of ag conservation easements and planning and land use policies were actually tied. And they each account for about a third of the overall policy response score. And this step is just allowing us to generate one value to serve as a broad indicator of each state's overall policy response to the threat of development. And we use those scores to think about the type of development that was driving state policy response, the effectiveness of key approaches, and how states' policy response compared to the current degree of threat. And Julia's going to talk a little bit about that analysis later in the presentation. So we summarized all of our results in the Agricultural Land Protection Scorecard. This is the version that you would see in the printed report, and Mitch gave you a little peek at the version that you would see on the microsite. In this table, each of the 6 policies is a row heading, and I just pointed out the land use planning row because I thought that would be of interest. In the second column, that's where we're showing the weights I just talked about, so the relative importance of each policy. You can read down a single column to see how a state scored across the range of policies we looked at. And the combined policy response score is pictured in the next to the last row. And because the scores are really, again, meant to serve as a broad indicator of the state's policy response, and because sometimes the scores were really close, we grouped them into quartiles. And those are shown in that last green row. Now we're going to look at some of the findings. So this map, which you got a preview of on the microsite, shows the state's overall policy response by quartile. The darker the blue, the higher the policy response. And what is immediately evident from the map is that every state has taken some step to protect its agricultural land. All 50 states have enacted property tax relief programs and have authorized local governments to plan and implement local land use regulations. Nearly every state has the authority to lease state-owned land for ag. Many have PACE programs, but their combined scores range from just a high of 59 in New Jersey to a low of 5 in Arkansas. So in other words, every state has the potential to do a lot more. Really only Virginia and New Jersey has the full suite of programs that we examined. And no state earned a perfect score for a single policy. So for example, although every state has a property tax relief program, only a handful of states are using term restrictions or dedicate withdrawal fees to land protection, which are factors that we looked at in the context of property tax relief. We also found that leading states were responding to visible changes in their agricultural landscape. You may have noticed on the map that we were just looking at that the top 12 states, which were ranked by their overall policy response score, were clustered on the coast. And on the East Coast, the highest response was concentrated between Maryland and Vermont, which is where we had some of the nation's leading PACE programs. And all of the West Coast states, plus Hawaii, also landed in the top 12. But on the West Coast, it was really land use planning that was the stronger approach. All of the high responders listed here tended to be very densely populated or to experience double-digit population growth, sometimes both, over the period when they were enacting policies. So really from sort of late 70s, early 80s to now. And lastly, we did perform a regression analysis, and we found a very strong relationship between the proportion of agricultural land developed and the policy response score. So as the percentage of ag land lost to development increased, so did their combined policy score. And this suggested to us that it's really the intensity rather than the extent of development that spurred policy action. And just keep this in mind as we get to our policy recommendations later on. And finally, we found that coordination was critical and key among those top 12 states. They were linking multiple programs and creating really state policy frameworks to guide local efforts. In general, the states that had multiple policies, especially PACE and strong land use planning, were receiving the highest combined scores. These bar charts here show policy scores for 2 states, New Jersey and Oregon. The state scores are represented by the green bars, as Mitch said when he was showing you them on the microsite. The median and top scores earned among all states implementing the approach are shown in shades of blue. So at a glance, you can see that both states have used multiple approaches, and adopting more than one approach is effective because the strengths of one policy can offset limitations in another. And also note here that it is not necessary to use all of the approaches to be effective and successful. That is certainly the case in Oregon. And we're not trying to be prescriptive in this assessment. We were actually just trying to share good ideas and what seems to be working. We also found that the leading states were linking policies and programs to enhance their effectiveness. So examples include Delaware and Pennsylvania, which require enrollment in the agricultural districts program in order to be eligible for PACE. This helps them assemble blocks of contiguous land ahead of permanently protecting the land. And in addition, the review and approval process for districts just streamlines the easement application process. Also in Maryland, Michigan, and New York, as I've mentioned already, we have Farmland Protection Program planning, which is informing comprehensive planning, and it's linked to their PACE funding. We also see that the effective programs tend to establish these statewide goals, and they prioritize local actions in this way. So for example, I think Oregon and Washington are our best examples where they have explicit state goals, and then they're requiring consistency between these goals and local plans. And they have pretty specific mechanisms that empower them to really back up and make sure they have that alignment. And finally, we have some PACE programs like those in Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania that have both state ranking criteria, and then they allow partner counties some flexibility to assign their own ranking, but within a state framework. So they're still all working towards statewide priorities. So that's my summary of the Agricultural Land Protection Scorecard. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Julia to provide an overview of high-level recommendations.
That's great. Thanks, Jen. And I think we're going to run one more poll. There we go. Just to get a sense of what some of you are concerned about these days.
Okay, so you should see the last question. Are you concerned about disruptions to our food supply due to any of the following? Coronavirus, pandemic, climate change, consolidation, and conversion of ag land. And we'll leave this open for another 30 seconds or so. And you can select all that apply, and it looks like folks are doing that. So thank you. All right, so a lot of concern voiced today. 80% climate change, 74% are concerned about conservation or conversion, 59% the coronavirus, and 36% consolidation.
Very interesting and very helpful. I don't know how I would actually score on that quiz, but I am at some level or another concerned about all of them. So Mitch, can you bring up the rubric? There we go. So this is what we call the rubric, which tries to pull it all together to compare the threats to the policy responses. I think it probably bears a little explanation. So the degree of threat runs horizontally with the higher threat states in the boxes on the right. And then the extent of policy response runs vertically with the high response states in the boxes at the top. Where you see the threat is greater than the response, they're shown in shades of, sort of red, but orange and red, with red being the worst case scenario. And then the more equivalent responses are in shades of green. So you'll see that a lot of the southern states are in the lower red box. And just to kind of read it a little bit, Texas is towards the top of the red box because it's had, relatively higher response given the red states, but it hasn't had nearly high enough a response to keep up with the threats. And then sort of comparably in the top right, you'll see New Jersey, and New Jersey has worked for decades to address the threat, so it has a very high policy response, but at the same time, it has very dense population and a lot of population pressure, so they have a lot to contend with. Oregon and Washington make it over into the lower threat relative to the other states because they've both done such a good job with their smart growth policies, which I feel like I can say to this audience. Anyway, but states that have, kind of a high threat and a reciprocally high policy response, most of them have been working for decades to address these issues. But even in the cases where they have really had a very strong policy response, the leaders even need to do more. And I think they all recognize that. So the fight isn't won quite yet. I think that's partly because new policy approaches are really needed to respond to the LDR conversion that Mitch described so well earlier, and that so many of you obviously have recognized in your work as this sort of insidious new threat that's creeping in and fragmenting the landscape. Unlike UHD, that LDR threat is really not driven by population. So it's likely due to weak land use regulations. And so all of us, I think, here on this webinar have a role to play in addressing it. I think that it's good to keep in mind that while development trends always have peaks and valleys, and real estate bubbles always burst, and those of us who've been at this a long time know that, the force and extent of the sort of the decline that we've seen in this century, not just in housing, but in all development, really was an anomaly, far below the rates of recessions dating back to, as far as the 1960s or before. And even the Great Recession, which had, a chilling effect on all new development, we still had 11 million acres of ag land developed, which is equivalent to all of the fruit and vegetable production in this country, which is something I think we really need to take seriously. And I'm glad to see that other folks on the call are concerned about that threat. We learned, and as Jen articulated so well, that people act when changes to their landscape are visible. LDR is hard to see, but it doesn't make it any less of a threat. So as Jen said, but it bears repeating, while every state has done something, they all can and must do more. And so we now have sort of a series of, again, pretty high level recommendations that we think that states can follow. To start, you can't manage what you don't measure. Effective strategies have to be based on solid data, and they have to be relevant to the places where they are. So toward that end, states really should track their ag land use trends and conditions. The federal government does it to some extent, but most states don't. While our LDR analysis really couldn't account for the myriad of local land use regulations across the US, state and local governments can collect that information and conduct those kinds of assessments, which would make our analysis richer and also make your planning and farmland protection efforts more effective. Most states have GIS capacity and could build their own criteria to map the importance of their ag lands based on their own visions and their own goals. The most sophisticated example of this is California's Farmland Mapping and Monitoring Program, which tracks and reports on land cover and use change over time. But other states have done things as well. Virginia has a well-developed model to identify strategic ag land resources. Connecticut has a Center for Land Use Education and Research, which provides information and assistance to land use decision makers. So there are lots of things that states can do to move this forward. Building on what Jen was talking about, states really need to adopt a suite of coordinated policies. This would be addressing those trends and conditions with clear goals and a suite of coordinated policies. And we recommend that states really start where they are, looking for opportunities within existing policies and programs. I think right now there are a lot of things bearing down on state and local governments, and it'll be really hard to start something out of whole cloth. But our research shows that strong, smart growth is really effective in curbing conversion. But most states could strengthen their planning authority by requiring consistency and coordination with local governments, calling for measures to protect ag land, directing growth to urbanized areas with existing infrastructure, really strengthening their efforts at smart growth, including in more rural areas. The 29 states that have PACE or PDR programs can strengthen them by incorporating a partnership structure to increase their capacity to do deals. They can increase their acquisition rates by dedicating sources of funding. And they can enact policies to improve the affordability of farmland and also be more strategic in their ranking criteria. These are just a couple of the examples we have in our report, but they all point to one conclusion, that states need carrots and sticks. They need a suite of coordinated policies which support ag economies and reduce the threats to ag land. So that kind of gets to the issue of supporting farm viability and access to land, which may not be so much in all of your wheelhouse, but I think it's really important to consider as part of your planning and your efforts because development pressure really is only one of the three major factors affecting conversion. So if we don't work to improve the viability of the agricultural sector, and I don't mean just sort of individual farms and ranches, but the sector, and facilitate transfer to a new generation, especially a new generation of more diverse farmers and ranchers, we're going to be in real trouble in the next 10 to 20 years. Because as farms and ranches consolidate and or go out of, it gets harder and harder for the remaining farms to survive. The vital infrastructure they need that supports them also goes out of business or consolidates, making it more expensive and time-consuming for producers to get the needed goods and services, to store, to process, to market, to distribute their products. So I think that a really good place to start is by looking for economic development opportunities. And I was a little disappointed we don't have more economic development folks on the phone or on the webinar, because I think that's a really good partnership to have between sort of planning and the ag folks and economic development. Maryland has a great example. Their Ag and Resource-Based Industry Development Corporation, or MARBIDCO, is a state-chartered economic development organization that helps farm, forestry, and seafood businesses prosper. But states also have things like farm viability programs to help producers with business planning, and in some cases, farm transfer planning and grant funding for capital improvements. So All of these things, I think, build up to one of my biggest takeaways and one of the things closest to my heart. Mitch, next slide, which is to plan for agriculture and for agriculture, not just around it. It's not just land use, right? It's not just farmland pres in an open space plan. I think, you know, a lot of you are planners on the phone and you plan for things from land use to transportation and affordable housing and economic development. But how many of you really intentionally plan for food or agriculture? And I mean that in a really kind of comprehensive way. And it could be embedded into a comp plan or it could be a standalone plan. But it really has to establish a framework to support ag economic development and to protect and conserve farmland for future generations. So it can occur at the state, the regional, the local level. It could be part of a food systems plan or a sustainability or even maybe a resiliency plan. But it really needs to address the threats of conversion as well as really what it takes for agriculture to survive and how to respond to sort of changing consumer preferences. And those preferences, you know, include things like local food, organic, humane, other values-driven production. And finally, and I think that COVID really has made me aware of the need for this, states need to include food and agriculture in their emergency management plans. You know, that's not just COVID, it's also for climate change and integrating ag into other resiliency efforts related to transportation and housing, as well as food systems and sustainability planning. So finally, our last takeaway is save the best, but don't forget the rest. And as you saw from Mitch's first map, which was the sort of land use land cover map, the ag landscape in this country is extensive and it's very, very diverse. Some of our land is really well suited to intensive food and crop production. More of it is better suited to grazing livestock. But it's all important to state and local economies and to healthy and resilient food systems. So going forward, we really need to become more sophisticated in how we assess, prioritize, and protect our vital ag resources. Special effort should be made to protect what Mitch told you about, that nationally significant ag land, which is critical for long-term food security and environmental quality. Policy action is needed both to stop development on nationally significant land and to protect it in perpetuity. But at the same time, we really have to remember that some of those lesser quality soils provide multiple co-benefits. Rangeland is not well suited for intensive crop production, but it provides valuable forage for livestock. It acts as a unique reservoir of native plant species and provides critical habitat for wildlife. With regenerative systems, livestock grazing on rangelands can lessen the impacts of climate change by increasing carbon in the soil, offering a valuable resource to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So long and short, save the best, but don't forget the rest. Next one. So to wrap up, you know, poorly planned housing, energy, transportation development all still continue to threaten our ag land base and the food systems which depend on it. While ag faces increasing pressures and challenges, consumers' expectations for plentiful, high-quality food keep increasing. And that includes demand for environmentally, ethically, locally sourced products, ecologically friendly, fair trade, you know, GMO-free, organic, and so on. And a large part of that trend, and I think it's really ramped up because of COVID, is the demand for local or regionally sourced food. Food grown close to market using short supply chains with states or regions where farmers often perform value-added functions from storing and packing to marketing, distribution, and promotion. But it's important to remember that most of that food is produced on small farms, so small farms which are so vulnerable within 100 miles of metropolitan areas. And so they're increasingly threatened by conversion, but also by economic factors. Meeting demand from these markets and this kind of consumer preferences will require more land. More farmers are going to have to balance the challenges and opportunities of farming in metro and adjacent communities, farming around LDR kind of development. And as this, what we call our food in the path of development chart shows you, is that almost all of our fruit and nuts, and really the vast majority of our vegetables, as well as more than half of our dairy and our eggs and our poultry, come from these metro or metro adjacent areas. Given the empty shelves that consumers have encountered with COVID-19, given the threats of hurricanes and fires and floods and so on that are coming increasingly with climate change, it's really clear that we need regionally diverse and somewhat redundant systems to support the growing and increasingly complex public demands from agriculture. So for that, we really need to make sure that every state secures a critical mass of high quality farmland and supports ag viability and a new generation of farmers and ranchers, while at the same time promoting regenerative farming practices to build healthy soil and combat climate change. And on that, we will take some questions.
Great, thank you, Julia. And we'll ask our panelists to turn on their webcams. We've gotten a lot of questions already, and you can continue to submit them through the questions tab. We'll maybe go over a little bit today, considering the volume of questions and the interest in this topic. So thanks to all of our presenters, and thanks to everybody in the audience today. I'm going to start with, I guess, a question that came up a couple times, kind of a definitional question. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about what FarmLink is.
Oh, sure. So a FarmLink program is a program that is working to bring together a farmland owner who wants to exit agriculture with a farm seeker, somebody looking to gain access to land and to enter into agriculture. And they can be administered by public entities, but many successful programs, some of the most successful in the country, are in fact administered by nonprofit organizations. And other models we see are hybrids of the two, where you have a state entity partnering with a nonprofit organization. And then, characteristic or common features, we see online listing services, and there are different degrees of complexity in terms of the freshness of the listings, the different criteria that they allow farm seekers to sort by. I've even seen some instances where the FarmLink program will allow a farm seeker to look for permanently protected land. And one thing that we were looking for was state authority to create the linking program, because to us that just suggested an ongoing level of commitment by a public entity. And they can also have training programs for land seekers, educational resources, networking opportunities. So those are all elements of FarmLink programs.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Another question here, and we'll kind of start at the beginning from earlier on in the presentation. Have you included in your assessment the incursion of solar arrays on diminishing agricultural lands? Now, that's an issue in a lot of places, including Maryland.
Yeah, that's a really important question that we get a lot, and we do capture solar arrays not as a separate category, but they are part of that urban and highly developed category, because to a satellite, they basically look like a parking lot. They're highly reflective, so they go into the same category as other developed land. And we're interested, actually, going forward, we're hoping to be able to do some additional work to try to tease those out and understand how much of the conversion is related to solar. And going forward, we're actually already working on another future scenarios analysis of what's coming down the pike in the next 20 years. And part of that will be thinking about future solar development and other energy development.
Okay, thank you. Next question, are there any geospatial tools for dynamically understanding the agricultural economy at the local, regional, and national scales?
That is fascinating. Maybe there are, I'm not aware of any. Dynamically and spatially understanding it. I'm envisioning a a modeling tool where you can dial certain things up and see how everything else changes. And I'd love to have that. I don't know of one that exists. There are certainly groups that are doing good modeling of the agricultural economy. The International Food Policy Research Institute and the Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute both come to mind. The latter, FAPRI, is at University of Missouri. They do really good work, but I'm not aware of anything that is, geospatial and relevant to a local area.
I'll jump in too. I would say I would love whoever asked that question to send me an email. We are working on a kind of pilot project in the Northeast, in the 6 New England states, New York and New Jersey, to come up with what we're calling an ag viability index that would be sort of a complement to the PVR index. And we do want to try to figure out how to depict some of that spatially. We're not nearly as sophisticated in this as CSP has been in the PVR analysis, but that is our goal, is to get there. So if anybody is working on this and would like to join us, I would love to hear from you.
Okay, and I'll share that information, at least what we have, with you, Julia.
And they can see my email up here, right? So
right, yeah, the email addresses, panelists, please feel free to reach out to them directly if you'd like. Okay, another question. Does the increase in the price of farms in part reflect overall inflation in addition to farms getting larger?
Do you want to take that, Julia?
I can start. I think we probably all can add to it, but I think there are lots of things that affect land values. So conversion pressure is certainly one. In the Midwest, you'll see that consolidation is another one. There are lots of forces that affect it, I would say. And so you kind of need to look at what's happening in your own local economy. I think what struck us is, again, that it's not just one thing, it's multiple things. And I think that especially for a new generation of people who are not inheriting farms, it becomes really difficult not only to compete with development pressure, but to compete with these large farms that sort of eaten up, like when the economy gets bad, they may eat up a lot of land. During the recession in the Midwest, corn prices were through the roof. And so you suddenly saw people almost like planting their front yards and again, increasing their land holdings. So there are lots of factors that affect land values. Jen, you might want to pitch in here too.
I was just going to say there's a very interesting report that if anybody's interested, NAS publishes average land values, agricultural land values every year. And it's great because you can get averages at the state level, which are less meaningful, but you can go down to county level. And so I know that that's of interest and very useful information. Just to give you a sense of where agricultural land values are in the place where you are.
And in case this audience doesn't know NAS deeply, that's the National Agricultural Statistics Service.
Thank you, Mitch. So a branch of USDA, and they're the group, the agency that actually conducts the census of agriculture, but they do more frequent surveys and reporting too.
Okay. Another question here. Is there a standard definition for low density or is it a relative term?
Yeah, so really, I think lots of people would have their own personal definitions of it. And so rather than wading into that bigger debate, I guess I'll just say that in our report, we have these two categories. They're very distinct. And they're identified in totally different ways. So we have the urban and highly developed, which is satellite-based, looking at the reflectivity and imperviousness of different surfaces on the ground. And then we also have low-density residential, which, as I described, is based on the census block method. So to try to translate that a little bit to terms that people are more familiar with, we're pretty confident that the UHD category will include, for the most part, developed subdivisions that are kind of an acre, lots of an acre or smaller. So one house per acre or more dense than that would probably be in urban and highly developed. If it's less dense than that, and the line might be in some places an acre, might be an acre and a half, there's some variability, but If it's less dense than that, so an acre or a house on 2 acres, 5 acres, 10 acres, that would be in our low density residential category. So again, to you, that might not seem like low or high density. It's a subjective thing, and it also varies around the country. But that break of kind of 1 to 2 houses, 1 to 2 acre lots is basically the distinction between urban, highly developed, and low density residential.
And I think, Mitch, the thing to add there too, in the sort of question of is it relative, it is relative in that we also tied the housing block data to the census of ag and to farm size. So we were really trying to get at what sort of lowest point does a farm not remain viable anymore, tied to that development pressure. So it does vary pretty widely across the country, depending on how rural the place is and how much population and how much pressure there is.
Yeah, we recognize that, you know, in a highly productive region right near a urban area with lots of markets, there are viable commercial farms that are an acre. But you're not going to have a viable commercial farm in West Texas that's an acre, so most likely. So we allowed the cutoff to vary across the country to try to capture some of that variability.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we actually got a question on that last point specific to it. Is there a way to determine how much agriculture is occurring in urban areas?
I know Julia will want to speak to that, but just in terms of the mapping side of things, it's a little bit tricky when we're using the National Land Cover Database categories to identify those, the urban and highly developed category. And there, you know, there's a category of developed open space. So it might be green, it could be a vacant lot that's being farmed as an urban farm, and that would be a great thing, but it will probably still fall into that urban and highly developed category. So that really urban agriculture is pretty hard to identify. But we could use our data to understand more about kind of on a metropolitan area basis where the peri-urban agriculture is going on and maybe how much of it there is. Really, a lot of that would be best done on the ground when you can actually go see what's happening. But with that, I'll toss it over to Julia.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mitch, that last point is so important. This is something that I really, really want, because I think that we would be surprised by how much food production is actually occurring in what we consider UHD areas. But to do this sort of nationally, using nationally available data sets is really hard. I think we really have to dig in at the local level and do that work locally. But I think it's really, really important to do. And I think that, you know, we're very clear, I think, that when we're talking about our LDR, that it encompasses lots of land use and different kinds of farms may or may not be able to thrive in that environment. But there are some, you know, especially old Rust Belt cities that have a lot of vacant land that are really doing, you know, real commercial farms within urban areas that, since for that spatial mapping we were using the NLCD, isn't going to get picked up. And the only way to do that is really to work at the local level, or state and local level, but really the local level, to identify those parcels and then start to really figure out what's being produced in them. The US Census of Ag is starting to try to get more into what and how much sort of market value is being produced in urban, but this is very new to them. So I think down the road, we're going to get a lot better at this, because I think people are increasingly recognizing the importance of analyzing how much ag really is happening in what we consider urban areas.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Several questions have related to providing some links to this information, and what we will do, as we usually do for these programs, is we'll include some links on the webinar archive page from the Trust folks, so we'll post that there, whatever you all want to share with us. Next question here is, at the beginning of the session, there was a reference to defining a viable size to support farming. I'm wondering if you have any further information to provide on what size was determined and the rationale for that size.
Yeah, we touched on that briefly, so I'll just briefly summarize again. What we did is, county by county, we got the distribution of farm sizes, and then we took the 10th percentile of that distribution. And the thinking is that there's a lot of farms that are more for lifestyle that are still registered or technically farms. And so some of those are often on the lower end. And so it might just be more of a hobby farm and not really commercially viable, and more likely to find that on the small end. And we went down pretty small. In many counties in the country, that cutoff is around an acre, which can be farmed commercially very successfully, but most of the time an acre size lot is not going to be used as a commercial farm, right? And so I feel like we were pretty permissive there, recognizing a broad diversity of potential viable agriculture models, while also recognizing that, you know, there's some properties or you know, structures out there that are farms but are not, you know, typically going to be in the commercial farming space. Anything that I missed, Julia or Jen?
Just to add on, in case people are interested, this was data that we requested again from USDA, National Ag Statistics Service, and it came out of the 2017 Census of Agriculture results. So that's where we got the entire distribution of farm sizes in a particular county. It's from that data source.
Okay. I guess a related question that just came in while you were speaking. What was the largest minimum size that you came up with?
I think it was 346 acres or something like that. And it was a county in West Texas. So big ranching country. Not surprising that the minimum would be high there. And realistically, given the low productivity of that landscape, especially without irrigation, you really do need a lot of acres to have a viable operation. And most likely that would be a grazing operation.
Okay. Common question here. The importance of land use planning is well understood. Briefly, what are some of the most effective policies in place, and what are the ones that seem to fall well short of their intended objectives?
So I would say the most effective, that in the context of what we were looking at, so in the context of the different elements that we were examining in the land use planning score sheet, it was that articulation of a very clear state goal, the requirement that local governments develop comprehensive plans that are consistent with that state articulated goal, and then the state having very strong mechanisms to ensure alignment. So when we looked in Oregon, for example, they had the ability, you know, they're reviewing the submitted comprehensive plans that are prepared by the counties and the cities, making determinations about consistency, and then they can in fact do things like cut off revenue sources to that local government if it is not, you know, being consistent with the state goals. So that's a pretty powerful, I would not call that an incentive, but it's a pretty powerful control to ensure consistency. And in addition, in that state, they are requiring the local governments to not just identify the productive and important agricultural lands, but also to adopt local land use measures to protect that resource. So that string was a very effective approach. I will say that the farmland protection planning as a substitute track in states that don't have that incredible sort of state level planning program, there are some good things about it, in that it does allow communities that may not have planning capacity to find another body with an interest in farmland protection. In New York, it happens to be the county farmland preservation board, can do some work to advance the issue. So, and then in terms of what hasn't worked out as planned, I have to think about that one. So I'm going to punt for now and be thinking and maybe come back with something.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Next question is, in your study, was it determined how many homes within LDRs participate in subsistence ag?
No, that's another one that you really would need on the ground data, you know, to understand. I've got a great big garden out the back window here, but on this 0.14 acre lot or whatever it is, you know, by any reasonable standard, this is urban, right? So getting down to that really granular level of backyard food production or subsistence production is really challenging to do from a remote sensing standpoint. I think you could do it with on the ground surveys, but that would be very time consuming and expensive. So we didn't get into that.
Yeah, but I'll jump in and I'll say, I think, and I don't know who asked the question, but from a food security perspective, it's a really good question to ask. And I think it's a really good question to address in local planning. Mitch is absolutely right. It would be, I think, impossible to do that sort of at a national level. But I think you could really dig in. And if you are looking at that, certainly, you know, sort of home food production, which often then is sort of shared communally, you know, or amongst many family members or even within the family, because when things come in, you know, if you're growing a lot of zucchini, as one who's grown a lot of zucchini, you end up with these big bats and you really hope somebody else will help you eat some zucchini. So I think it's a kind of a non-market economy, if you will, where people are sharing food. But if you are looking at that, I also would encourage you to look at other sort of sources of subsistence, including hunting and fishing, because those can come into play a lot, especially for, you know, providing protein in the winter and so on. It's a really, to me, this is a fascinating topic, but we couldn't get into it in this work.
Okay, thanks, Julia. Next is a comment and a question from Sally Holbert. And she starts by saying, I loved Julia's comment, you cannot measure what you do not measure. I'm very interested in the measuring of integrated pest management operations, including chemical and non-chemical activity. The American Farmland Trust having a focus on IPM programs and adaptive management.
I don't know. I'll start it, but I think I'll hand off to Mitch. He's the real scientist. But we used to do a lot of work around IPM. Nowadays, we focus maybe more broadly into this idea of regenerative agriculture, which includes IPM, but includes climate smart farming and other things that maybe Mitch will want to pick up on. But I think it's really important, you know, even though this isn't so much what this particular report did, that when you're thinking about planning for the future, that we do think very much about how we manage the land that we want to protect, not just protecting it, the number of acres, but making sure that we're encouraging really sound farming practices so that it's making a positive contribution to our environment. So Mitch, this is really more your bailiwick than mine.
Well, I'll just say, rather than going off about regenerative, which I think would be interesting, but I want to address that question as much as possible. My predecessor, Ann Sorensen, was a real expert in this, and she's done a ton of work over the years, and a lot of that has been in partnership with the IPM Institute, which is, you know, which is a very active organization. So I would recommend for the questioner, if you want to get deeper into this, to reach out to the IPM Institute. I would be shocked if they haven't done survey work. Now, I don't know the geographic reach of that and whether it would apply to the area where you work, but they'd be a great resource. And also there may be some questions in the Census of Agriculture around pest management practices. That rings a vague bell. I don't know, Jen, if you're familiar with any questions related to that.
I actually don't remember seeing it on pest management, conservation tillage and no-till. So I've seen those kinds of conservation practices. I'm also wondering if you looked at one of the bigger ag universities that are doing regular survey work on their own, that they might include some of those types of questions on different types of practices in their operator surveys.
Okay. Next question here is, where do you see vertical farming or novel farm production fitting into integrated food planning?
I think that falls under kind of the banner of urban agriculture and different ways that folks in urban areas are looking to increase the amount of food production. We're so much into land-based. I read about it somewhat, but it really isn't our area of expertise. But there are definitely people who are working on that issue.
Okay. Could you speak a little bit more about market-driven farmland preservation tools, such as the transfer of development rights?
Do you want to take that? Yeah.
I can start off. Is that we look at transfer of development rights on a less frequent period. So I think the last time we maybe surveyed programs might have been 2012 or earlier. It is very effective. You're right that it's harnessing the private dollars, because you're trying to find out what developers in a community want, and then have that be how they can apply development rights. And we've seen some very interesting models, including the use of development rights to actually build at a lower density, if that's what the development market is for. We've also seen it used to increase commercial square footage, and also sometimes to change parking requirements. There's a town nearby here that is in fact using it in that way to change the local parking requirement and reduce it. So they apply it to a commercial space. What I will say, in my own direct experience with TDR, is that I think it's complicated, and I think it requires a level of planning capacity that many rural communities don't have. So the community where I was on a volunteer board, we had a volunteer planning board. So what we did in terms of TDR to make it successful is we relied on the infrastructure provided by our state farmland protection program. So we said, we don't want to hold easements. Any easements that happen through our TDR program, we want the state farmland protection program to hold, because they have the ability to steward the easements over time. We also set up a mechanism to allow the developer to give the town funds instead of actually having to transfer rights. We figured out a mechanism for them to just pay into our kitty so that we could put it towards farmland protection projects, and that would sort of count as the. So all of that is to say that when we have last done our surveys, because of what can be the complexity of TDR, I've seen a whole bunch of programs start out, and then I'll actually see declines in the number of programs, because over time they just sometimes collapse under their own weight, and hopeful communities can't make them go and keep them going. But I think where you have had successful programs, I've seen there's either really great planning capacity in that community, or they found a way to take advantage of other systems, either county, rolling up to make use of county capacity or state capacity to help them run. So those are some observations.
Jen, what would you say about mitigation programs, which are sort of related but maybe not as complicated?
Yeah. So, and this is interesting, because there's a lot of interest in mitigation ordinances, and it's something that we're thinking about in possibly a next phase of the policy scorecard, is to start looking at mitigation ordinances. And we see examples in California, and then some state level approaches in Massachusetts and a few other places. And yeah, it is absolutely more straightforward, Julia. I think sometimes at the outset, maybe it's a little less palatable, because, and it does require, like the places where I've seen mitigation ordinances, they have pretty strong agricultural protection zoning in, and they're saying if there's a change, if there's a request to change the use in this agricultural zone, you're going to be mitigating for that. So I think there has to be some kind of control in place in order to make it work. Although, you know, in Massachusetts, the other model has been the state requiring some mitigation under a state executive order. And so that's a really interesting example that we'll be exploring. So the state requiring farmland mitigation when a developer, and there's state money involved, and the developer is converting prime and important soils in Massachusetts. So.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. We'll have a couple more and then we'll wrap up here. And thanks to everybody for submitting all these questions. We won't be able to get to them all, like maybe only about half or less. Here's a comment to respond to, and that is, I'm involved in a regional scenario planning program for 12 counties. One thing that I notice is that well-meaning planners who all understand valuing farmland still label farms and forestry lands as undeveloped on their maps. We need to get away from this mindset. It is developed land. It is a farm or a forestry program tied to this land. Response to that?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's actually why our sort of heading is, you know, plan for agriculture, not just around it. Agriculture is not open space just waiting around to be developed to its highest and best use. In many places, it can be its highest and best use. And if we thought about things beyond just, you know, the land value, but the value to a rural community or even to an urban community of what that land is providing, I think that we would take a more comprehensive view to planning for agriculture. So yes, I totally agree with that person, whoever you are. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Because similarly, where you or I might say manage or protect farmlands for future generations, others might view land use planning as a type of government control. Do you have any anecdotes about how some jurisdictions have dealt with some of this potential pushback from landowners?
Right. That's an interesting question, and I'm nodding because we've been getting a pattern of questions about this challenge of, if you're thinking of adopting stricter land use regulations, how can you do that if your ag community is against that kind of proposal? And this feels somewhat in the same vein. And I think part of what we were suggesting is to start having conversations with your ag community, both the producers and then also other ag experts, so NRCS, the districts, other people who know agriculture, and start to build trust with that community, listen to what they say is needed to help make them more successful, and that you could phase in approaches. And you may not make sense to start with the stricter land use regulations. That's going to feel like you're taking, you know, the perception is going to be you're having an impact on their land values. So instead, you know, as Julia was talking about that concept of planning for agriculture, consider what the ag community is saying they need to be more successful businesses. And so maybe it's streamlined permitting. Maybe it's the ability to do more direct marketing on their farm operations site. So if you start to reach out to the ag community and hear what it is they're saying they need to be successful, I think you build some trust so that they'll begin to feel more comfortable and open to other proposals in the community.
Okay, thank you. I guess we'll have one last question before we wrap up, because we've gotten a couple of questions in this vein here. How would you categorize the small but growing agrihood land use model with clustered homes associated with small to medium sized farming operations?
I think that one probably falls to me. I'm actually sort of fascinated by them, and I haven't visited any of them except maybe Prairie Crossing, sort of some of the initial work that came out of Illinois years ago. But other people at AFT have actually visited some of them. And I read Urban Land Institute did a really interesting report about them. So I think it's a really interesting development. I think there's a little danger of what is the role of the farmer in the community, and making sure that they actually have a future and are really embedded in the community, and you're not sort of bringing in somebody who's at a different level if you have, you know, very wealthy people in a community, and then you sort of have your cute little farm. So I think that just like any other new development or planning, being very intentional about what your values are and what your goals are is really important at the start. But I actually think it's a really interesting new sort of development model, and I look forward to learning more about it as these sort of roll out in more places over time.
Okay. Well, thanks, Julia. We reached 2:45. We did go over today, but appreciate your time and the breadth of the conversation today. You can see the email addresses of each of the presenters today. I'm also going to send the questions to them so that you can see what we didn't cover today. So thank you all. I guess just one last question, if you all had any closing thoughts, things to leave us with as we kind of consider what you've said today and what people are doing on the ground in their own communities.
Mitch, Shen, you want to go first? Do you want me to go?
I'll just throw out there as you know, probably the person who knows the least about land use regulation and the planning process on this team, that, you know, we think that we really need to do a full court press to understand and address low density residential. And, you know, it's maybe a bigger, higher priority in certain parts of the country, but it's happening everywhere. And I think this audience is the one that's really going to figure it out and come up with the good ideas that work and that are fitted to the characteristics of the different communities. And so I just hope that what we've provided kind of opens other people's eyes. I'm sure you already know about it, but hopefully it's a tool to open other people's eyes, and that it can help, you know, us all move forward to address it.
Yeah, I have similar comments, which is that I think planners can be very creative because you're right there, you're hearing what is needed in your community, and you can come up with responses. And I just hope that, you know, based on some of the information we provided today, you'll really put your creative minds to thinking about how to plan for agriculture.
So I guess I'll do the wrap, and ditto to what both Mitch and Jen said. Absolutely. I guess I'll also say, you know, we've done these kind of webinars for different kinds of audiences, generally more agricultural audiences, and I just really love the kind of questions that we got from you. I think they're really good questions for us to think about as we think about how to build on this work going forward. We're thinking about, are there tools coming out of this work that would be useful for planners at both the state and the local level? So if anybody has ideas, please share them with us. But I guess I found the questions really sort of interesting, but also inspiring to think about sort of where we could go with this kind of work, and really appreciate all of you participating in the webinar and sticking it out even though we ran long. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Great, thank you, Julia. And with that, this will conclude our webinar, Farms Under Threat, the State of the States. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Julia, to Mitch, and to Jennifer for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your inbox for details on other future webinars, including Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis with Dan Perolik on July 28th, next week, and for other webinars on parking management and other topics that we'll be sharing in the coming weeks. Visit smartgrowth.org and watch for these blasts for more information. Have a great day.